You feel him pulling away. The messages have dwindled, the meetups are more spaced out, and that intense connection seems to have dissolved into thin air. Doubt starts to creep in. Has he lost interest? But what if his silence isn't a sign of rejection, but rather a hint of something much deeper? And what if his distancing is actually an unconscious response to the very intensity of the feelings he's still trying to make sense of? This video dives deep into that emotional dynamic that's so often misunderstood. We'll explore what might really be happening behind the scenes of the male psyche when his behavior shifts in subtle yet powerful ways. Get ready to look beneath the surface and understand the hidden layers of this withdrawal. If you believe that love begins with self-knowledge, write in the comments, "I am ready to see clearly." In Carl Jung's analytical psychology, many emotional and behavioral conflicts stem from unconscious contents that emerge when we're faced with situations activating the deepest parts of our psyche. When a man starts to act distant, just as the bond strengthens, it can be linked to projection and the shadow, two fundamental Jungian concepts. Projection occurs when internal aspects, often unconscious, are attributed to someone else. At the beginning of a relationship, it's common to project ideals of love, security, even perfection onto the other person. As the relationship becomes more real and feelings intensify, your partner stops being just a projection screen and starts to be perceived in depth. That can trigger an internal clash, especially if he hasn't integrated parts of his own psyche, like the anima, the archetype of his inner feminine. That's when the shadow steps in. Everything he rejects or doesn't recognize in himself can surface uncomfortably. Intense affection, for instance, can awaken insecurities, fear of vulnerability, or even old traumas. Distancing then becomes an unconscious defense against this inner storm. Jung's journey of individuation involves recognizing these internal processes and integrating opposites, reason and emotion, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious. If he's pulling away, he may paradoxically be drawing closer to something essential within himself. And though it seems contradictory, this movement can actually signal that he's beginning to fall in love in an authentic way. At the start of any romantic connection, an instinctive enthusiasm drives closeness, intense exchanges, mutual curiosity, the thrill of novelty that sparks both desire and hope. However, when the bond deepens, another layer of the psyche comes into play: vulnerability. For many men, especially those who weren't encouraged to explore their emotions, true affection sets off an internal alarm. It's as if the heart says yes, while the mind, conditioned to protect, shouts, "Be careful." According to Jung, emotional vulnerability opens doors to parts of the psyche that haven't always been well integrated. Feeling exposed, touched, or affected by someone can threaten an internal structure built over a lifetime to avoid pain, failure, and above all, loss of control. For many, loving isn't simply surrender. It's confronting traumas, outdated expectations, and the fear of repeating wounds that may have been buried for years. So distance can be less about disinterest and more about self-preservation. It's an instinctive, often unconscious move to restore internal balance. Genuine love touches the most delicate regions of the soul. It reveals the inner child, often neglected, who once longed for nurturing, but was met with rejection or abandonment. Reliving those feelings, even in a new context, can be terrifying. This fear isn't rational. It isn't a cold choice like, "I'm pulling away because I don't want this." On the contrary, distancing happens while affection still pulses, because it still pulses. The intensity of feeling can feel like a threat to an identity built on self-control, independence, or emotional denial. In many cases, a man finds himself torn between two internal forces, one pushing him toward connection, the other pulling him back into his psychic safety zone. It's as if he's caught between the desire to surrender and the dread of getting lost in that surrender. This inner conflict can manifest as confusion, silence, withdrawal, and even contradictory behavior, one day affectionate, the next distant. But all of this is part of a deeper process. From a Jungian perspective, this kind of movement signals that something significant is emerging from the unconscious. Emotional vulnerability activates dormant parts of the psyche, which can spark both growth and resistance. Love stops being a mere pleasant feeling and becomes an agent of inner transformation. When a man pulls away, he's often seeking time and space to reorganize his internal structure in light of this new emotional challenge. It's in this space that individuation, the process of becoming who we truly are, begins to unfold. He needs to understand who he is in the face of this new affective reality. He must confront his own image of masculinity, childhood wounds, and inherited relationship models. And this doesn't happen instantly or in a straight line. It's important to understand that this type of distancing doesn't necessarily spell the end. Sometimes it's the start of a deep, silent, and intense journey. A journey that, if respected and comprehended, can lead to an even stronger, more authentic bond in the future. When a man becomes emotionally involved on a deeper level, he inevitably encounters parts of himself that until then lay dormant. Jung called the anima the archetype of the feminine in the male psyche, not as external femininity, but as the internal representation of sensitivity, intuition, receptivity, and the capacity for emotional surrender. When a man truly begins to fall in love, that archetype is activated, stirring not just enchantment but inner chaos. The awakening of the anima isn't gentle. It rattles rigid psychic structures, challenges long-held beliefs about what it means to be a man, and above all calls the individual to integrate emotional aspects once rejected or underestimated. Encountering this inner feminine can be uncomfortable for someone who spent a lifetime believing strength lies in not feeling, that vulnerability is weakness, and that control is essential to stay respected and intact. When he starts to feel something real, those beliefs are quietly yet powerfully challenged. The anima doesn't simply awaken feelings of love, it also acts as a bridge between the ego and the unconscious. Through it, a man begins to notice the soul's subtle signals, desires that defy logic, intuitions without explanation, emotions that call for acceptance rather than solutions. This new internal territory can feel like a labyrinth at first. The natural instinct is often to retreat. It's exactly then that distant behavior appears, a defense against an inner transformation that's begun but isn't yet clear. The relationship then shifts from being just an external experience with another person to becoming a mirror. The partner reflects the anima. She unconsciously represents everything he still needs to integrate: sensitivity, surrender, emotional depth, connection to the subtle. That projection can be enchanting at first, but quickly turns challenging because it forces him to confront his own emotional limitations. He sees in her what exists within him, but that he doesn't yet know how to handle. This process is essential for individuation. Jung said that the path to personal fulfillment inevitably involves integrating the feminine in men and the masculine in women. Distancing, then, can signal that this process is underway. It's not that he's running from his partner, but from her as the mirror of what he can't yet accept in himself. This reaction is an unconscious invitation to an internal dive, a call from the soul to grow. Many men, when they hear that call, experience crisis, confusion, anxiety, fear, even anger. They may rationalize their withdrawal with practical explanations like, "I'm not ready for a relationship," or "I need to focus on myself right now." While those phrases can be painful, they carry a symbolic truth. He truly needs to turn inward, not to flee from the other, but to rediscover himself on a new level of consciousness. That rediscovery only happens if he has the courage to face the discomfort and dialogue with his anima. When he does, he not only matures emotionally, but becomes capable of relating to the other in a much more authentic, profound, and loving way. The presence of the anima humanizes him. It brings balance, making him more whole, and in that wholeness, true love can flourish. So if he's distant, perhaps he's being summoned by something far greater than he can yet express. Something within him is being touched in an unprecedented way. And in this process, distance can paradoxically be the path through which he draws closer to his own essence. When two people meet and begin an emotional bond, what's at stake goes beyond desire or visible compatibility. In the depths of the soul, unconscious forces start to move, and one of the most significant is projection. According to Jung, we project onto others what we haven't yet recognized or integrated in ourselves, both qualities and flaws. In love, these projections run especially deep and become even more impactful when tied to unresolved aspects of the shadow. For Jung, the shadow is the hidden side of the psyche, everything repressed, denied, or simply never brought into consciousness. It holds both negative and positive contents. In many men, the shadow can contain repressed sensitivity, fear of emotional dependence, insecurity, guilt, childhood wounds, and even a profound yearning for true connection, all suppressed by earlier traumas. When he falls in love, His partner often unconsciously embodies that shadow, reflecting what lies within him and begs to be acknowledged. Love awakens and illuminates, and it's precisely that light that reveals what was hidden. When a man starts to see in someone else parts of himself he doesn't want to see, his fragility, contradictions, or need for affection, the natural impulse can be to step back, not because he doesn't love, but because he feels too much. And in that excess of feeling, defenses arise. He projects his shadow onto his partner and views her as excessive, demanding, confusing, or too intense. But in truth, it's his own internal contents playing out on the relationship screen. This kind of projection creates internal tension. The masculine ego, accustomed to maintaining a coherent identity, begins to fragment before this new perception. True love, unlike idealized love, confronts. It shows what needs healing, what's out of harmony within. That's why distant behavior can be an unconscious escape from this confrontation. By pulling away from his partner, he tries to pull away from his own shadow. So distance isn't a sign of disinterest, but of psychic overload. He needs space to process these projections, to understand why he's reacting as he is, and above all to differentiate what belongs to him from what truly belongs to the other. That differentiation is crucial on the path to individuation, because only when he acknowledges his projections can he begin to integrate those aspects and take responsibility for them. Interestingly, the shadow also contains hidden potentials. Sometimes what he projects as something negative is actually a repressed strength. For example, he might see his partner as too emotionally intense, but what's really being activated is his own emotional capacity, which he has never allowed to flourish. The fear isn't of her, but of himself, his own depth, his emotional truth. Distance thus becomes an attempt to reorganize his inner identity in light of this new revelation. Jung emphasized that integrating the shadow is painful, but absolutely necessary for psychic maturation. As long as the shadow remains unconscious, it will keep being projected, and relationships will cycle between enchantment and frustration. Recognizing this is a giant step on the journey to conscious love. When he realizes that he's reacting not to the other, but to what the other awakens within him, he begins moving back toward his own center. Distance, then, can be a necessary interval for self-reflection. It's the space between projection and perception, between the impulse to flee and the choice to stay with awareness. When that crossing is made, when he understands that what bothers him outside is often a reflection of what's inside, something transforms. The relationship stops being a battleground and becomes a field of growth, and it's at that point that a true meeting becomes possible. Viewed only through visible behavior, distancing looks like denial, but from a Jungian perspective it can be profoundly symbolic. Individuation, the core concept of Jung's work, is the process of becoming who you truly are by integrating all parts of yourself, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, reason and emotion. There is no individuation journey without moments of withdrawal, rupture, silence, and internal reorganization. That's why, when a man pulls away just as he's beginning to feel love, it can be an essential step toward maturing into his most authentic self. The relationship with another serves as both a mirror and a catalyst for this process. When the bond deepens and emotional intensity rises, the internal structures that once provided protection show their fragility. The masculine ego, often built on ideals of control, invulnerability, and rational strength, collapses before the force of genuine affection. In this scenario, distancing represents an attempt to reorganize identity in the face of a transformation that can no longer be avoided. The man on the road to individuation must at some point confront his internal contradictions. Love provokes that confrontation. It shows that you can't control everything, that loving means letting go of certainties, that surrendering to someone also means ceding some control over your emotional world. It's at that moment that distancing can arise, as a pause, a symbolic space needed to find a new point of internal equilibrium. During this period of withdrawal, there's a descent into the unconscious. He revisits beliefs, fears, and past experiences. Often he must face deep wounds tied to abandonment, rejection, failure, and the fear of not being enough. To outsiders, this process may seem invisible, but inside it's a storm, a symbolic death of the old self to make way for the rebirth of the true self. Jung called that symbolic death, the collapse of outdated psychic structures so a new self can emerge. At this juncture, the hero archetype also comes into play. In the archetypal journey, the hero must face darkness, undergo trials, and lose himself before finding himself. The man who pulls away because he's beginning to love truly is often in the midst of this trial. He's not denying love, but transforming. His withdrawal isn't flight. It's a silent confrontation with unfamiliar territory within himself. If he successfully navigates this inner journey, his return to the relationship happens at a new level of consciousness. He comes back more whole, more capable of loving with presence, more willing to live the relationship without so many shields. And it's then that love becomes authentic, not a repetition of childhood patterns or a search for completion in the other, but a meeting between two whole beings who have each begun the path to wholeness on their own. The paradox of distancing is that, contrary to appearances, it can be the bridge to deeper closeness. Time alone, silence, inner conflict, all help transform love from idealization into a conscious choice. He no longer loves out of need or mere enchantment. He loves because he's willing to build, sustain, and dive in. And this kind of love demands maturity, something attained only by traversing one's own darkness. For the one on the receiving end of this distance, understanding the process can bring relief. Knowing that his silence may not be a no but a not yet, that his withdrawal doesn't negate his feelings, but reveals their depth. And above all, that sometimes you must give the other space to find himself, so that one day he can return truly, no longer as part of a game, but as someone who has chosen to love with courage and presence. When a man begins to pull away just as the bond strengthens, it's easy to assume rejection, disinterest, or confusion. But from the lens of Jungian psychology, this distancing can carry a much deeper message, the beginning of an inner transformation. The fear of vulnerability, the awakening of the anima, the projection of the shadow, and the path of individuation are invisible forces shaping visible behaviors. Understanding these dynamics lets you see beyond the surface and realize that sometimes silence speaks more about love than words ever could. This script has been an invitation to look more deeply at human emotions, to respect the internal rhythms of someone opening up to love, and to cultivate patience and clarity. Not every distancing marks an end. Sometimes it's the start of a more authentic closeness, possible only when each person finds their own wholeness. If this message touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and watch the video appearing on the screen now. Personal transformation begins when we look within, and true love blossoms when we choose to grow even in the pauses.